Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday morning forum at the Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco. We're so glad to see you here. Our technical expert, Bruce Newberger, over here, will be letting everybody in on the Zoom meeting, and John Maliska will be helping us with the Q&A, and Melvin over here has provided a beautiful breakfast for us, so help yourselves. My name is Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and I'm chair of the Human Rights Working Group and a member of the Forum. And we are very pleased today to be welcoming Professor Bill Hing, who has written a book on immigration, and he'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. What I just want you to know before we begin is that this program is being videotaped and will be available on YouTube in a couple of days. So if you do not want to be seen by chance, please exit from your picture by clicking off your view button at home. In the chat box, you'll notice two contacts for the UU committees who will put on these Sunday morning events. They're uusf.org/forum, that's easy to remember, or uusf.org/HRWG for Human Rights Working Group. We'd like to have you give us feedback on all of our events, so please send them to us, or if you're here right now, you can sign up on our sign-up sheet over there on the table. And on the table are copies of Dr. Hing's book, Humanizing Immigration. So during the Q&A session, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you'd like to write anything on the cards here as he's speaking, then we'll honor him later. And now before the presentation, please join us in an Ohlone recognition. And here is Willard Chin to give the Ohlone recognition.
Thank you, Dolores. This area, now known as San Francisco, is the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the original people of this land, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibility as the caretaker of this place. We as churchgoers, residents, and as professionals working in this community are learning on their traditional homelands. We recognize and we wish to pay our respect to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone community. And this church has always embraced social justice as our core value. And it's not just words, but deeds, whether the forum where we are learning about issues are important to our everyday lives, whether it be learning from sensible cinema, the film or video series, having original voice talk about issues and or joining organizations or groups within the church like the Black, Indigenous People of Color group to, again, have a safe forum to exchange ideas and advance social justice. So please, get involved with other aspects of this wonderful church.
Thank you, Willard. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Bill Hing. He is a professor of law and immigration studies at the University of San Francisco, right up on the hill behind St. Ignatius. He runs an immigration clinic at the law school and has written many books on the subject that are very interesting, including the current book, and he will talk more about that right now. Welcome, Professor Hing.
Thank you, Dolores. It's always a pleasure to be here. Jonathan was asking me earlier how many times I've been here to speak, and it's probably been close to half a dozen times. And even during the height of the pandemic, I think I did one online. So thank you. It's always nice to see good friends like Dolores and Bruce and Lotus and Melvin at this event because they make me feel at home. So I graduated from law school in 1974, And I've pretty much been doing immigration law ever since then. And so if you do the math, it's 50 years. And I have written many different immigration topics and race relation topics over the years, and it has been frustrating, to be honest with you, when it comes to practicing immigration law. And the frustration is born of two things. One is the unnecessary display of unkindness that immigration authorities often display to non-citizens. I mean, come on, you can enforce immigration laws, but you don't have to do it in a mean-spirited way, in your tone of voice and in your actions. People usually follow your orders. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a minute. And the other thing that has just been sorely frustrating for me is the inaction of Congress to do the right thing and to correct some injustices in the immigration laws that have given rise to backlogs in regular immigration that in some situations are over 20 years long, and also not recognizing that some people deserve a second chance when it comes to the possibility of being deported from the country. The first immigration client, you could say, that I represented was someone when I was in law school. And I actually was working at an organization that those of you who are old-timers in San Francisco recognize the name. It's San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation. There actually once was a legal aid office that had neighborhood offices around the city. There was one in Chinatown, one in the Mission, one in Hunters Point, one in Western Addition, which is sort of where we are, one in Central Cities. And I was in the Chinatown office because I can speak a little bit of broken Cantonese and a little bit of broken Spanish, and I'll get to the Spanish part in a minute. But I was doing mostly landlord-tenant work as a law student, and we had successfully completed a case on behalf of a Spanish-speaking resident in Chinatown. So I was a law student, and I interpreted for that client with the attorney who was representing him. And we got a nice settlement for that client who had been mistreated by a landlord, actually. And so we called him in to the office so I could present the check to him. And he was happy about receiving that little settlement, but I could tell that there was something that was going on that day that made him really not his normal self. And I asked him what was going on, and he said, well, you know, I went to the immigration building yesterday, and many of you know it. It's 630 Sansom Street in the financial district. I went there and because I want to file a petition for my wife who's in Mexico, and I went there to ask how to do that. And so I walked into the building, and they sent me upstairs, and I went upstairs, and an investigator looked at my green card and said, I don't think this is a real green card, and took a pair of scissors and cut it in half, okay? And then he said to the client, actually, you're right, it's real. I made a mistake, but see you later, kind of thing. And so that had happened to our client, and he told me that story. And I actually didn't know any better. Of course, it was outrageous as far as I was concerned. So I said, well, let's go down there. Let's see if we can find that investigator and make him correct this wrong. Again, I didn't know any better because I was a young law student. And so we went down to 630 Sansom, and he remembered what floor he had been to the day before. And we knocked on the door, and somebody opened the room, and it was a room probably about half this size with a number of desks, gray government desks that were, and people were seated behind the desks, and he looked and he said, "That's the guy over there." And so we just marched right in, and I confronted the investigator, and I said, "You know, my client tells me that he was here yesterday," and he said, "Yeah, I remember him, and that you took out a pair of scissors and cut his green card in half, but it was a valid green card." And he said, "Yeah, that's true." And so I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" He said, don't worry, just go downstairs to room 100 and they'll take care of it." And I thought, wow, you know, maybe victory. And so we went downstairs to room 100, and this is the first time I had ever been in that building. And I went down there, and he said, what we found out was that it was the public information room where people stood in line to ask questions and to get forms. There was a line of 150 people that day. It took us 2 hours to get to the front of that line. And at the front of the line, the person said, "Well, I mean, he should just apply for a replacement. Here's the form. It'll probably take 4 to 6 months." And so that was my first experience. And just one more in terms of the insensitivity. When I was a young lawyer, at that office, I had a good relationship with what then was called the International Institute, and they had an office on Broadway, on Van Ness near Broadway, and in a beautiful old Victorian building. And they invited me to come speak one day about immigration rules and procedures, and I did that. At the end, they asked me to represent. They wanted me to meet a client that they couldn't figure out what to do with. He was from Eritrea, and this young man was a student who was accepted on a student visa to go to school at Fresno State. And while there, he, within a few weeks of registering at Fresno State, he became very short of breath. And so he went to the campus nurse or facility, and then he went to a cardiac specialist, and he was diagnosed with a disease. I think it's called Eisenmenger syndrome. And what it is that when you're at any kind of elevation, your heart doesn't work properly. And so he was told that, and so he immediately moved to the Bay Area, and he started taking classes at San Francisco State. And that was the mistake that he made, that he did not actually get permission to transfer schools. And he was told by the people at International Institute, "We're not sure if you're going to be able to stay in status." To make a long story short, I filed an application for change of schools and submitted the requisite medical documentation, his statement explaining that he didn't realize that he couldn't just change to another school. And I argued in the letter that he had the serious disease. He couldn't stay in Fresno, even though you don't think of Fresno as a high elevation place. It's apparently more elevated than San Francisco. And so I guess I understand why that was denied, because he technically went to a different school that he wasn't supposed to, and so it was denied, that request. But in the rejection letter, the person who made the decision wrote, "You applied too late, and if elevation is a problem, then you should take a boat back to Eritrea." Okay, so that's just a little taste of And I can tell you a lot more different stories about Border Patrol officers, immigration investigators. But that kind of attitude actually runs, unfortunately, throughout the system. And of course, there are good, decent people that work. I've spent a lot of time at the border, and I've even met Border Patrol officers that I like. There are some very good people that have taken money out of their own wallets to pay for food. I know enforcement officials that have turned a blind eye to individuals that are removable. And so I don't want to indict every single person who works for now, what is part of the Department of Homeland Security. But the environment of the institution is such that it does attract a certain group of people that really think that they're saving our country from an invasion of wrongdoers, and that's most apparent at the border. It's most apparent by some individuals, but it's now become apparent in some polls. And I was talking to Bruce about this earlier, that over the generations that I've been doing immigration law, I've always felt a certain comfort that national polls actually show that most Americans favor immigration and favor a broad legalization or amnesty plan for undocumented immigrants. But in the last couple of years, that has shifted, and the polls have become more negative than positive. And I think it has a whole lot to do with placing immigration at the forefront and in the headlines day in, day in and day out. And I honestly do believe that it began when Donald Trump announced that he was going to run for president, and he came down that escalator and said that Mexico was sending criminals and rapists to the country, and when he became president, politicizing the border, so that today the border is viewed as a problem. It's viewed as a crisis. It's viewed as a border crisis. And what disturbs me most is that there is little, even with the Obama and the Biden administration, there is very little explanation of why the migrants are coming to the border. There's very little explanation of who they are and what their stories are. So I challenge anyone who is critical of the border and what's happening there to go with me on my next trip or with any other group that is going to sit down and talk with people. And I do this a couple times a year. I was just there in October. The clinic that I helped to run with 3 other attorneys, and there's the actual director of the program, Jacqueline Brown, is just the smartest asylum lawyer that you will ever meet. We go once or twice a year to the border. We also go to detention centers in Arizona and Texas. And we also work with groups on both sides of the border, in the Nogales, Arizona area, Nogales, Sonora on the other side. It's the Kino Border Initiative. And in the Tijuana area, it's Al Otro Lado. I challenge people to come with us and sit down and chat with the folks the way we do. And you will not, if you were opposed to those migrants coming before you went, you won't after you sit down and chat with them. They're not coming for a walk in the park. The vast majority of immigrants today would rather stay home. They would rather stay home in comfort and peace and safety and the ability to feed their families, but they're not. And you can look at it as an economic and poverty problem, but you have to dig deeper. Because why is there those problems? And it's all unfortunately rooted in extreme violence. In the three main countries that we deal with, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and I've been to all three countries, you can see it. It's not safe, and we can talk about El Salvador in a minute because there's been strange things going on there now for more than a year. And somebody just said it, I forgot your name that I talked to in the beginning when I walked in. You and Bruce? Richard? Richard said it when we walked in, when I said a similar thing. He said, nobody's gonna walk 1,500 miles carrying their kid if there's not a good reason for that. And last weekend, I think there was a migrant with a child that died in the river near Eagle Pass, Texas. And it doesn't happen every day, but it happens more often than the media covers. And so that's my understanding, and that's why instead of the billions of dollars that we spend on militarizing the border, we really ought to be smart about how we can possibly help those countries in terms of getting their feet back on the ground and helping with economic development in a meaningful way. Instead of the way USAID currently distributes more than 80% of its money, it goes straight into the hands of the governments. And the problem is that those governments have histories of violence themselves and control without actually working with grassroots organizations that are trying to work on education, trying to work on job training. I mean, I'm not kidding you. I found in recent research, it was refreshing to me that Cisco Systems, okay, one of the big IP conglomerates in the Bay Area, they are single-handedly doing more for educational efforts in those countries than the United States government is. They've invested millions of dollars, Cisco Systems, in training young individuals in those three countries in what they know, which is IT. And so every year they graduate 4,000 to 6,000 young kids in IT work, and it's with no government assistance. It's all with partnerships with community-based organizations. And they contacted me because they heard I was affiliated with the university, and they want help in English language training because they've discovered that their graduates can make more money if they can also speak English, not just know the tech. So one of the things that most moved me in the last few years to sit down and be more thoughtful about what I would put in this book was an experience that I had in 2019, and so it was before the pandemic, and to this day, I actually think that I still suffer a little bit of PTSD from the experience that I'm about to describe. I had, prior to the visit that I'm going to describe, I had been to family detention centers in Texas. There's one in Dilley, Texas, that's outside of San Antonio. And I had been there a couple times. Jacqueline had taken some students to do volunteer work for weeks at a time. To his shame, Barack Obama is the person that opened the family detention center in Dilley, Texas, and Trump expanded it. And basically, the people that were housed at Dilley were women and children. And so it's women who came with their children would be detained until, usually for at least 3 weeks, until there was somebody that they knew in the country that would vouch for them, then they would be released. But it was like a little prison camp. And what I first witnessed, we were there to interview people because of a case called Flores that involves making sure that kids in detention are treated properly, any kid, even if their parent is with them. And so in the Flores, in the Dilley facility, there was a room about half this size, but an audience about this big, a group about this big, with women and their children. And they were there to hear daily announcements, but to also explain what the process was going to be. And I thought that was bad, because what I saw, there was only one word to describe the children that I saw who were with their mothers in the Dilley Detention Center. And that word is lethargic. They had no energy. They were not playful. Many reverted to bedwetting. They were clingy. They were in detention. And I couldn't help but think about, at that time, I had my first granddaughter, and I juxtaposed the vision in that room with watching my granddaughter and my daughter-in-law in their comfortable living room not far from here, and her being a clown and playing around, and I couldn't get that image out of my mind, and because we're also lucky where our daughter-in-laws and granddaughters are not in detention, okay? And so I remember coming back and writing about that, and how in the world could we as a country condone those kind of conditions. And so I thought that was bad until I went to Clint, Texas in 2019, again, as part of an inspection team, because the attorneys who handled the Flores case had heard that in the facility I just described was run by ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. It's separate from the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol also detains people, but they're only supposed to detain children for less than 72 hours. So the attorneys in the Flores case had heard that the Border Patrol was detaining children who were on their own, not with any parents, who were on their own, was detaining them for more than 72 hours. And that the judge authorized us to go and do an inspection over a period of 3 days. And so there was a team of 7 that was assembled, and it was mostly lawyers, a couple paralegals, and a pediatrician. And we all spoke Spanish. You know, my Spanish is good enough to go through a questionnaire with a kid. And so we first got there, and the Border Patrol detention facility, yes, there are rooms, but there's no outside area. Dilley at least had outside areas where kids could go out. There was a very small yard that was like maybe a quarter of this size room. And we were very proudly told by the head of the Border Patrol at Clint, listen, we do the best we can, and I want you to know we serve them 3 hot meals a day, okay? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And so we had the authority by the judge, the federal judge, to have the entire list of people, of kids, and we could pick whatever ones we wanted to interview. And so we decided on some sibling groups. We decided on ages, because you had to be under 18. It was for children. And so I myself, the youngest person that I interviewed was 4 years old, but he was with his sibling, okay, who was 11 years old. They are regarded as unaccompanied minors, even though they were accompanied by an adult. When you come with your parent, then you are detained with your parent. But if you come with your grandmother or your aunt or your adult sibling, you're separated at the border. Even today, that's always been the rule. When you come to the border with an adult who's not your mom or dad, you're separated. You're taken away. So Donald Trump was infamous in 2018 for separating parents from their children. I guess that's worse. But every day we separate grandmothers, aunts, and uncles from children that are not their direct child. So you may find this very hard to believe, but the youngest person that was separated from their aunt at the border was 3 years old. How did I find that out? Well, so what we were doing was we had to interview people and kids and ask them a list of questions. What are they feeding you? And what happens if you feel sick? And do they let you call out if you have a number? And everybody I interviewed actually had a phone number in their pocket of a relative or a friend. And then we typed it up on our laptops, and then we downloaded it to a thumb drive, and then we took it to a printer to print the declaration, and then we go back and then we read it back to them in Spanish, and they sign it. Even the 4-year-old that I interviewed, which I'll come back to in a minute. And so I was interviewing somebody, and I typed up her declaration, and I went into a conference room where our printer was located to print it. Well, the conference room had a long conference table, very long conference table, and there was one interview going on at one end of the conference table and another interview going on at the other end of the table. One end of the table, there were 2 attorneys, because one of them couldn't speak Spanish, and they were working together, interviewing this kid that was like 3 years old, okay? And I couldn't believe it, you know, but then she was crying, and then what I saw as I walked her to the printer was that the 2 attorneys walked that 3-year-old over to a young teenager who was being interviewed, and who had another kid on her lap, okay? And I thought, oh, well, that must be the mom, and because immediately the 3-year-old calmed down. I found out all these ages later on. And so I printed my document, went back, and then at lunchtime, we all had lunch together in that conference room, and I asked everybody in the room what the hell was going on, what I saw. And what they explained to me was the teen who was sitting there, who was 16 or 17 years old, she was the mother of neither one of the children. She was just a young, nice girl who was housed in the same room as the 2 girls who had been, they're different, they weren't related, who had also been separated from the adults that brought them. And out of the kindness of her heart, she took care of them. And you know, it was just unbelievable that that happened. And I guess a couple of things. So the 4-year-old that I represented was his 11-year-old. They were brothers, and when I walked in to interview them, the 11-year-old was very, very sharp and articulate, but but his 4-year-old brother wouldn't talk to me. And so I proceeded to interview the 11-year-old. And every once in a while, I'd turn over and try to say something to the 4-year-old who would not respond to me. And so I asked the 11-year-old, does your brother speak? And he said, oh, yeah, he speaks, he's just shy. So after 20, 25 minutes, I kind of completed talking to the 11-year-old, and I decided to go see if the pediatrician was available. And so I went, and she was available, fortunately. She's much smarter than me. She had packed in her suitcase balloons and bubbles and little games. And so she walks into the room and immediately starts blowing bubbles. And that 4-year-old just started jumping and laughing and smiling. And he talked to her immediately, okay? That's what I mean. She was a lot smarter than me. And she, we got him, but it was also very clear that he had a speech defect. And so the pediatrician was worried about that. And the 11-year-old explained that both of their parents were in the United States, and that he, in fact, they lived with their grandparents, and that he pretty much had taken care of his little brother before his brother was 1 year old. And so we wrote letters. We each wrote separate letters to the Border Patrol attorney who was with us, just to get it on the record that they should not be separated because the 4-year-old relied so much on his brother. And I guess the final thing about Clint is the hot meals. And so I laugh, but it's not funny. Breakfast was instant oatmeal with hot water, okay? Lunch was Maruchan cup of noodles with hot water, okay? And dinner was a frozen burrito that was zapped in the microwave. That was their 3 hot meals. And they received, I guess I forgot to mention, most of these kids had been in detention for 2 to 3 weeks. The Border Patrol wasn't supposed to be keeping them for more than 72 hours. After 72 hours, they were supposed to be turned over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which has its own problems, but it's a little bit better. Every once in a while, they would get fruit, and juicy pouches was their drink, or water. And so there were a couple nursing mothers who were teenagers that I interviewed, and they didn't know that they could ask for formula because they didn't get any extra nutrition. Everything I just described was their nutrition, even though they were nursing. And I asked a guard after I was interviewing this one nursing mother, hey, she doesn't feel like she's producing enough milk. Is there a formula? He said, yeah, there's formula. I said, well, they didn't know. And he said, well, they didn't ask. And so I have a whole chapter on that experience, and that really, it does haunt me a lot. I actually devote my book to those children because I've continued to worry about them and wonder if they're okay, and I help them make phone calls. I think most of them ended up okay, but who knows, right? I guess a couple of other examples that I want to give you that I write about in the book are 2 different people that face deportation that have lived here for a while, okay? One is a gentleman who I met through his daughter, who had heard me speak at an event like this when she was in college. And And she later actually became one of my law students, and now she's an immigration lawyer. But she came to me because her father was about to be deported. And the Obama administration had issued a memo called a Morton Memo, which was intended to send a message to local immigration officers. You know, if there's somebody who's not a criminal, somebody who's lived here for a long time, why deport them? You have the ability. Obama sent this message to local ICE directors. I'm authorizing you to use your judgment. And if you think somebody doesn't need to be deported, then that's fine. And so the young girl, her name is Zulma, said to me that she had heard about this when I talked about it, and would her father qualify? And I got information from her, and the father was not in detention, and I got the information from him. And he's a guy who lived here for 25 years. He was working 2 jobs. He had 2 U.S. citizen children. His wife was also undocumented. He worked at the Hilton in the restaurant as a dishwasher, and then he worked at a pizza parlor. And to this day, we don't know who, but somebody called ICE up and turned him in. And so I showed up at the Hilton Hotel in Emeryville and went to the back and asked for him, and he came forward and he got arrested. And here's the thing, when you've lived here, when you have no criminal problems and you've lived here for 10 years, you can apply for something called cancellation of removal. The law provides, if you live here for 10 years, good moral character, and you can demonstrate extremely exceptional hardship on your children if you're deported, then the judge has the discretion, the judge has the power to grant you a green card under cancellation, okay? So you have to live here for 10 years. He lived here for 25 years, no problems. I didn't represent him at that time. He was represented by another former student of mine who did this great job and introduced these letters about him being active in church, a soccer coach, drove his kids to practice, and everything that you would want, right, as a parent. And the immigration judge granted cancellation, awarding him a green card. But the government attorney appealed. In immigration law, unlike criminal law, in criminal law, if you win, you're the defendant, the government cannot appeal, okay? In immigration law, if you win, the government attorney can appeal to something called the Board of Immigration Appeals. The Board of Immigration Appeals reversed in a 2-paragraph decision, saying that he actually wasn't any different. The hardship that the kids were going to suffer was not any worse than anyone else kind of being separated from their parent. And that's when they came to me, and I argued under the Morton Memo, the person shouldn't be deported. I submitted a 100-page request for discretion under the Morton Memo. That was denied. Even though during the Obama administration, I had a dozen friends that worked in high levels of government for the Obama administration, in Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and I knew somebody in the White House. All those people told me, that guy should get protection under the Morton Memo. But when the local ICE director, a guy named Tim Aiken, denied it, they said, we can't reverse him because it's his show in the Bay Area. It's a discretionary thing, and so we can't reverse him. So, and his letter was, no, I'm not I'm not going to let him stay because he's not any different from any other Mexican who has lived here for more than 20 years. And so it's disturbing, and that's why I conclude, I'm going to open it up for questions now, but I know it's a scary concept, but I really conclude that the whole system ought to be abolished. And, you know, I know your questions, and you can ask them anyway, but my questions are, my answer is, we got to rebuild this thing with a heart, okay? Not with national security at the forefront. Just think of your own neighbors, friends, co-workers, whatever, that are non-citizens. The folks that I'm talking about are exactly the same. They're not, criminal rates among non-citizens is lower than the national average. Public assistance use, welfare, is lower than the national average among lawful and undocumented communities. And so I don't get it, and that's why I argue that we ought to rebuild the system. So let me stop there, and we can take some questions.
Professor Bill Hing, thank you so much for your presentation today. So we have some questions that we're glad to take here from people willing to use the microphone. We're also accepting written things that I will attempt to read out for the professor. Are there any people here in the conference room that want to ask a question? You want me to stand over here? All right.
Professor Hing, we have a question from one of our members here, but he can't be with us. His name is Art Persico. He's with the Grey Panthers. He says, I believe kindness and prioritizing human rights, not fear and xenophobia, should guide our immigration policies and all U.S. domestic and foreign policy. What kind of U.S. immigration policy would that look like? In other words, what should we as activists be demanding of our Congress in regard to U.S. immigration policy? Thank you.
Sure. So the two main things is to demilitarize the border, and we have the ability, it's not a scary number, we have the ability to process and interview folks and schedule them for hearings, okay? We can do that. We've done it in the past without detention centers. We ought to get rid of detention centers, that's part of it, and interview people and schedule them for hearings. We can do that. The absconsion rate of people who are allowed in and are not detained is 3%. That's the absconsion rate, okay? And even that absconsion rate, I think I'm skeptical about, because a lot of people don't get proper notice about their interviews. So the vast majority show up. The second thing I would do is expand the visa system. Let's create more legal immigration categories. There are a lot of people that would rather come and go, that kind of stuff. I'll be honest with you, that scares some of my pro-immigrant worker friends, because when they hear me say that, I say, Bill, are you talking about a guest worker program? I kind of am, okay? Yes, not a bracero program where people get exploited, but there are some people that would prefer coming back and forth for seasonal work as long as they have labor protections. I'm also in favor of an expanded seasonal worker program.
I think we have a question right here.
My question is related to not only the U.S. immigration, but there's an immigration problem going into Italy going into England, all over. It's not just the United States. There's something happening worldwide. And I want to know how do you think this is, or why do you think this happened? Is it related to COVID and everybody decides to say, I can't take this anymore and I have to do something? But I feel it's not just America, but it's elsewhere, and I don't know what's causing all of these things in all the different countries.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's not just an American issue. First of all, there's a huge refugee crisis around the world, and some of it has to do with climate, okay? And the Le Pen in France and the anti-immigrant movement in Germany that ousted Angela Merkel because she was actually trying to show compassion towards Syrian refugees is very akin to the kind of rhetoric that Trump and DeSantis are putting forward as well. My main answer is information. I really think that we do an awful job of explaining that we need to know who the individuals are. I'm repeating myself. What is driving them? And I want to believe that there's still a vast group of people in the middle who, they don't think about immigration that much. But if they have information, if they have correct information, they'll do the right thing. And so that's what I'm devoted to, is trying to profile the average person, not the perfect straight A student who's going to get into medical school, and there's plenty of those too, but just kind of the average immigrant family and person. And I think what most people will see is themselves, that they're just kind of regular people that we don't have to be afraid of. And I think that needs to be done worldwide, because the social media and the proliferation of anti-immigrant rhetoric around, if we don't stand up and try to respond to that, it's overwhelming us, and we're seeing that in recent polls.
Professor Hing, do you agree with the notion the U.S. will benefit from creating an orderly immigration process whereby immigrants are welcomed, allowed to work, live, and eventually qualify for citizenship?
Absolutely. I think that that's core to comprehensive immigration reform. Let's set up a system that we can have requirements, okay? But let's be upfront about it, and let's set up something that can be done very quickly, because that's what most people want. Most people want safety. Most people want to contribute. And I think you'll actually find out that many of them, after a while, if it's safe back home, they will go back home.
So another question we have here, a very talented member of our congregation asks, how do I sign up for your next trip? Any idea of when?
Yeah, I've been asked that question a lot, and contact me. My email address is on the University of San Francisco website. Very easy, just go to the website and Google my name, and you'll get my email address, or Dolores and Bruce have it too. And I promise I'll set up something special, because I'd like you to do one of two things. I don't actually want to take you on just a voyeuristic kind of thing, because I want to talk you into at least helping to serve meals at those facilities on the other side of the border. And if any of you have any legal training, we can actually train you in actually helping people fill out forms and stuff. But when I go, there's always a group that's volunteering to serve meals, distribute clothing, that kind of thing.
I'm going to hand you the contact details for this person, who I think is very eager to do whatever they can.
Sure, thank you.
I think we have a question here.
Is this on? Okay. My question is, I was just curious how you got involved in this kind of work, to begin with.
Mm-hmm. I wish it was a romantic story about the fact, and this fact is true, that both my parents were detained at Angel Island. My mom for a week and my dad for 3 months many decades ago. I wish that I could say that, and that could plausibly be true. But the truth is that I wanted to be a housing attorney at the legal aid office. But the only job opening when I graduated was in immigration. And so they offered it to me and I took it. And of course, I have loved doing that work ever since then. So it was kind of by accident.
So in addition to the spoken questions that we have, in addition to the written questions that we're collecting, we're also taking questions from online. We want to appreciate our online audience. And this online question says, it seems like the local ICE official, Tim, should have been fired and replaced by the Obama administration. Would that have been possible?
He could have been transferred but not fired because they're federal civil service, they're protected. But, you know, I did a survey after that, and I'm happy to send it to you. I wrote a 100-page law review article to get it off my chest, what happened, and I did a survey as part of that article. And it turns out in different parts of the country, my client would have been granted, but in other parts of the country, he also would have been denied. And so what are you gonna do, transfer all of them? Maybe, yeah, but I agree with the sentiment.
Yes, you mentioned Biden, and I'm still kind of unsure of what exactly he must be aware, you know, about these things. So what exactly is he doing about it?
Yeah, and in fact, the president appointed Kamala Harris to address root causes within a few months of taking. They're aware. They're also afraid of the immigration issue. And I really do believe that they've concluded that they also have to go along with the rhetoric of the border is a problem in order to be reelected. I think that that is what's going on. I know, just as under Obama, I currently know people that are friends of mine in the White House, in the Department of Justice, and DHS. Maybe you could say this is to his credit. To Biden's credit, he doesn't surround himself with sycophants, okay? He actually has debate going on. But what I am told is that he's not listening because for political reasons to the people that want him to do the right thing on immigration. I have friends that are torn about showing up for the election. You still got to show up. You still have to vote for Biden, unfortunately. And so,
Professor Hing, I think you touched on this before. Given the seemingly unstoppable growth of climate change, especially heat in the southern hemisphere, is helping local governments with training programs likely to keep foreign populations in place?
not entirely. That's absolutely right. We've got to simultaneously, the climate is the biggest issue, right? And so we have to constantly be vigilant about that and do everything that we can for our grandchildren.
We have another online question here. I agree we need a whole new system, but who is in the best position to get it done?
Well, there's some pretty good people who even in the administration, but they don't have the clout. Alejandro Mayorkas is being criticized a lot. I actually know him. He's the Secretary of Homeland Security, and they're trying to impeach him right now. He's pretty good on this issue. Another person who's that works very closely with the White House is Tom Vilsack, the former governor of Iowa. He's actually great on immigration issues. So there are people that are in great political positions who could come to the forefront and lead on this issue.
How many years has it been since immigrant workers had a pathway to legalization?
1986. So when President Reagan was in office, he signed Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, and 3 million people benefited from that. And he got advice by his National Council of Economic Advisors to sign that legislation, because his National Council of Economic Advisors said, we need to legalize these workers because they're vital to the economy. And it's still true.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom. So I heard you say Professor Bill Hing said, re-elect Ronald Reagan. Thank you. Sorry. Can you tell us, what is the reason given for separating children from parents and adults?
Well, they claim that we're not sure if they are being trafficked, if the children are being trafficked. And don't get me wrong, there probably are some kids that are being trafficked in a bad and awful way. But why do you have to have 100% policy of separating them? Can't you investigate quickly to determine whether or not this is really your grandmother or really your older sibling? It doesn't make sense to me, but it's a blanket rule that if it's not your mom or dad, you're separated.
Following up on that, how successful have we been to reconnect the children separated from their parents?
Well, that's a really good question, because that was ongoing litigation where Trump separated, I think it was like 2,000 at the end of the day, parents from their kids. And I think there's still an outstanding number of like 200 or something like that. Can you imagine? That they lost their kids. And that was 2018.
Do you have any knowledge of labor contractor recruitment of immigrants to explain some of those coming to the border? Do you have any information about guest workers? It's my understanding that a lot of workers in the fields and other work sites are contracted workers. Do you see this as the future of low-wage U.S. labor? In other words, contracted workers or rent-a-slaves?
Yeah, my understanding is that a little bit of that goes on, but it's difficult now because the border is so sealed. It's very difficult, actually, to just come across undocumented. And so while there are attempts at unscrupulous farm workers, agribusiness and other seasonal bosses to do that, it's not as much as before. What is more happening is recruitment of undocumented workers who are already here by unscrupulous employers. And that I read about all the time.
We have a question down here.
Can you hear me? Yes. How did Reagan do that in 1986? And then how would Majorca and Vilsack proceed? I mean, where is the force in this? And
Reagan was able to do that because Congress realized that we needed to do the right thing, and now many of you can help me. I can't remember who had control of the House and the Senate at that time, but I'm embarrassed that I can't remember. But Congress believed that we should pass legalization, and it came on the heels of a commission on immigration reform that started under Jimmy Carter, and it was a bipartisan commission, and they recommended legalization, and Congress took that recommendation. It took them a few years, and they passed it, and Reagan signed it. Vilsack and Mayorkas, I answered that question in terms of, well, if there are people who could implement something in a good way, those are examples, okay? But they cannot implement anything unless Congress authorizes it.
I'm going to modify this question a little to try to get at the underlying idea of the question. Are you advocating for the sensible idea of ending Homeland Security?
Absolutely. I testified against Homeland Security. After 9/11, I was invited to testify in front of Congress, and as the Senate committee that Dianne Feinstein was on, and she knew me, and she said, "Oh, wonderful to see you, Professor Hing, but I disagree. We actually need Homeland Security." I felt that we didn't have anything to gain by adding another layer of scrutiny, because if you look at the people that did us harm on 9/11, which was awful, it had little to do with getting around the immigration laws. They all had valid visas, and they were just, it could happen today. The bad guys are capable of rallying bad guys against us, but now it's just delayed everything.
I think you touched on this earlier. The question is the Biden administration working to correct separation from relatives?
No, they continue this policy. They don't separate parents from children, but they continue the policy of separating children from their aunts, uncles, grandparents, and older siblings.
Is the reason no pathway to legalization has been paused after decades because of the hunger for cheap labor and undocumented workers are more exploitable? Would you call our labor system a kind of apartheid system?
Yes, definitely. That's a story that is not told very often, because an employer cannot knowingly hire an undocumented worker. The employers that do that extract the equivalent of a tax from those workers. They say, well, we're not going to pay you so much because I might get fined if I get found out, and don't complain about the extra hours you have to work and that kind of stuff, because you ought to be grateful that I'm hiring you. So that whole system is set up to exploit more workers.
Professor Hing, looking at one sample, I'm imagining the group of immigrants dumped on Martha's Vineyard. How would you envision their lives if there weren't the problems with the immigration system and there were little or no barrier to their entry?
Oh, I mean, that's pretty easy. People that I know who have successfully come in and they've gone through the process, and again, if they can show that they're fleeing violence, at least gang violence, cartel violence, or even domestic violence, they can be successful, and they can get a job and become productive, and eventually they get lawful permanent residence card, a green card, which is wonderful. The other thing I want to say about Martha's Vineyard is that community stepped up and showed that they had a caring, compassionate nature, and that really made a huge difference in the lives of the individuals that got there. They made sure they got food, shelter, clothing, and representation.
Is it not our government's fault that Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala have problems, such as attempts at regime change, drugs, accessibility to guns?
Great question. The person who wrote that question knows history. The United States has its fingerprints all over Central America, and it's government, CIA, but also multinational corporations that have gone in to exploit and extract resources, and we have a lot of responsibility to those folks, because we helped to put them in that situation that also fomented class differences and violence.
Professor Hing, you've done an amazing presentation today, and at this point, I'm going to ask the last question, so thank you so much for fielding all of the inquiries here. Can you give us reasons for a second chance of citizenship?
Yeah, one example that I didn't give was of people who have committed crimes. Okay, right now, if you've committed something called an aggravated felony, your deportation hearing lasts 5 minutes, even if you have a green card and you've lived here for 20 years. Okay, what I'm saying is that somebody who's lived here lawfully for a number of years, who in 15 seconds or 15 minutes does a crazy thing, we should give them more than 5 minutes at their hearing. We should be open to redemption and the ability to rehabilitate. You don't have to buy their case. If you don't believe them, if they're not credible, fine, go ahead and deport. But if they can make a case that they have changed their lives, and these are folks that have all gone to prison already. They've gone into prison, they're not trying to avoid their sentence. I think that we should have it in our heart to understand that some people deserve a second chance, even if they once did something very bad.
So at this time, I want to express some appreciations for some people that made the presentation possible today. Jonathan Sill continues to do an amazing job with our technology and our AV. Our facilitators for the morning forum, Bruce, Dolores, and Melvin, continue to do a great job organizing. We're delighted that so many people were here in person. We are delighted that so many people online joined us for this forum presentation. And lastly, we are delighted to have the wisdom and expertise of Professor Bill Hing.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. And just a reminder that next week we're going to be doing a presentation on the housing situation here in San Francisco. It's called Yes in My Backyard, YIMBY, Solutions to the SF Housing Shortage. And the person representing them will be Jane Natali from YIMBY, and I think it'll be a very exciting program. So do come back or watch us on Zoom. And now Bruce has a real exciting message for you.
Okay. Well, I want to invite everybody to come back here at noon, after the service, and there'll be lunch, but there'll also be writers from UUSF. There's going to be 6 different writers. They're going to be reading from their works, and you'll probably recognize most of them, or if not all of them. So anyway, that'll be happening beginning around 12:15, 12:30. So anyway, thank you. Thank you for coming.